Good morning. I thank the Korean Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy for hosting this meeting for exchange of information and ideas among partner states, and to KOSTI for inviting me to share my views on the subject. I've been studying multilateral export control regimes since early 2003-2004, and in my review of developments since that time, almost 20 years ago, I'm happy to see that some recommendations we made have been adopted by the regimes, like the formal adherent status and more intra-regime dialogue. But it also pains me to see that some challenges remain the same, like the impact of unanimity principle on changes in control lists or duplication of efforts in producing generic good practices documents. And these have now been exacerbated by two developments: emerging technologies and increased geopolitical competition among major suppliers. A quick recap of the basics. The regimes, one should remember, were set up to improve coordination among supplier states, who were also like-minded. As you will see later, as the like-mindedness has decreased, decision-making has become more difficult. So the important thing to remember about regimes is that they support non-proliferation objectives of non-proliferation treaties from the outside. Some call this the establishment of soft law based on voluntary agreements. The voluntary nature and smaller groupings were considered ideal for dealing with a dynamic issue area, technology, where the speed of treaty amendments would not work. So regimes coordinate export control policies among participant states, which are suppliers. They identify items of non-proliferation concern. So we have control lists with strict technical parameters. They also establish the basis for licensing of these items, which is the guidance documents for the regimes. And finally, they identify new proliferation challenges and ways of mitigating these challenges, which are the good and or best practice documents that the regimes have issued from time to time. The regimes are informal political agreements. They are not formal treaties. They are not formally linked to NPT, PwC, or CwC. But they do aim to facilitate the implementation of these treaties. We should also remember that despite being political agreements, the guidelines and control lists are adopted into national laws by member states. So they're not optional. The other interesting part about the regimes is that these are closed membership organizations. You can only become a member by invitation. Here's another twist regarding this invitation. They use the unanimity principle to make any changes to the regimes. So guidelines, control lists, and even admitting of new members has to be agreed upon by all of the current member states in a particular regime. Now, what the regimes are really valued for is information sharing among members. So you have information on threats, procurement attempts by actors, license denials, and in the case of us, in our licenses, approved. Now, the reason for sharing that kind of specific information is because the regimes want to make sure that member states do not undercut other members' license denials. They also discuss, and this is at the level of technical experts, common licensing and enforcement challenges, which are useful in identifying obvious things like if a particular actor is trying to acquire the same technology from different member states. Over time, regimes have also started sharing information with non-members. And in this case, there is outreach by chairs, by individual members, and the websites of the regimes have fairly detailed information which non-members can look at, understand, and see if they want to adopt any of those recommended guidelines. The regimes, as I mentioned in my first slide, have several operational challenges. One of them is, of course, quickly updating the control list. So even though there is a small number of member states, updates are hampered by mismatch between the growth of technology and the speed at which unanimous consensus can be built within these small organizations. Sharing of intelligence is also problematic. Now, intelligence is needed for implementing catch-all controls and ensuring no undercut. But if there is lack of trust among some members, they would not share intelligence with the entire group. There is also increasingly an overlap in control lists. For instance, UAVs are controlled by Australia Group, MTCR, and Wassenaar, lasers by NSG and Wassenaar, and chemical energetics, chemicals that behave in specific ways under pressure, by MTCR, NSG, and Wassenaar, but not Australia Group, which does cover all other kinds of chemicals. Advanced materials similarly are covered by MTCR, NSG, and Wassenaar. This creates problems for industry in their due diligence. So there is also criticism that the regimes have been issuing general, non-regime specific good practice documents in the same issue areas. For instance, transit and transshipment under NSG cannot be that much different from transit and transshipment good practices for MTCR or Wassenaar, and so on. This creates unnecessary duplication of efforts and confusion, again, for the industry. There is also differing levels of implementation and enforcement capacity among member states, including in their resources to host meetings, for instance. And there is also a time lag in how changes at the regime level are adopted into national law. So technology, as I said before, has become a problem. It develops too quickly for governments to understand the proliferation implications and to develop national positions. It's much harder to negotiate upgraded multilateral standards of control when all the partners are not on the same page. Also, when different partners see different domestic economic implications of new control standards, consensus is much harder to build. There's also a big debate among scientists and industry about which of the so-called emerging technologies are truly emerging, or whether they are foundational technologies that are being used in new ways in different technology sectors. The upshot is that these kinds of technologies cannot be regulated in terms of generic or use-independent control thresholds. And there is the emergence of new potential suppliers. So production in different locations requires sharing of designs and other technology. Even under non-disclosure agreements and strict contracts, there is transfer of technology to producer country. Also, if such a country does not abide by the same STC standards or cannot enforce them, proliferation is likely to happen. This is a major concern. On implementation, we are still struggling with how to implement ITT and catch-all controls. This is what we discussed even in 2003, 2004. And these have become more difficult when paired with the context of industrial espionage and hybrid warfare, where you use non-state actors, for instance, through attacks, cybersecurity, IT systems, not just for ransom, but for intelligence collection, and for technology acquisition via academic institutions. And finally, members are no longer like-minded. Great power competition and geopolitics have returned visibly. Autonomous weapons that cede decisions on targeting and precision attacks to AI-based systems are a good example of the use of foundational technologies for delivering either conventional or WMD payloads. UAVs can be customized for missions, whether recon or rescue or attack. Much like specific bioweapons, UAVs can be used for targeted assassinations as well as localized release of pathogens. This makes it harder to develop control thresholds. The consensus on proliferation threats has weakened, with the thin line of separation between state and non-state actors engaged in criminal activities getting erased. Where proliferation for WMD reasons is just one of the many malign uses of technology. The final challenge is that in many countries, the same disruptive technologies are a result of million or billion-dollar investments in R&D and a source of market dominance through first movers' advantage. Bringing these technologies under controls means more costs of compliance, whether it is in export control paperwork or due diligence about overseas partners or screening of customers. So what does it all mean for Asian countries that are not part of the regimes? First is that regimes are likely to expand membership in the near future. Adherent status, however, will bring more information on proliferation trends and typologies. More importantly, if you are part of a critical supply chain, or you have the potential to become part of another chain, it'll mean that regime members will provide capacity building assistance. But you will also have to show demonstrably higher levels of implementation and enforcement. Finally, the difference of geopolitical and economic interests among member states, especially among the prime movers, is going to continue to complicate decision-making within regimes. A good example is US. For the past few years, US engaged in dialogue within the MTCR on UAVs. And finally, in 2020, they unilaterally revised their interpretation of some of the Category 1 UAVs. These can now be exported so long as their maximum speed is under 800 kilometers per hour. So this kind of unilateral behavior might become more common in the coming years. So non-members will need to find ways of communicating their preferences through bilateral and regional meetings, especially when they are having discussions with prime movers in the regimes. The discussions are going to be difficult, but if Asian countries do want to have a say in how these technology control regimes are going to respond to emerging threats, they will need to engage in these difficult discussions.